Thanks. I'll tell some stories about Irish Catholic people and organisations in Australia. They're mostly personal stories with a few comments on how they fit into the wider narrative. First slide, please. Yeah, then the next one after the title. Yeah, thanks. Here are some of the topics we'll look at. I hope some familiar and some less familiar. First of all, Father Dixon and the Castle Hill Rebellion, the Irish ecclesiastical empire of the late 19th century, and Cardinal Moran and Sheeran and Hennessy, Eileen O'Connor and Our Lady's Nurses for the Poor, Mannix, we can't leave him out, I'm sure, around the Bory log and rural Catholic culture, something on the organisations of, roughly speaking, between the wars, the Knights of the Southern Cross, occupational guilds, the Joey's First 15, and a little later, the Carl Government, the Police Guild of St Christopher, the Labour Right, and the Vice Squad.
Oh my God.
Next slide, thanks. So this is the basic plot of Australian Catholic history that those individual stories fit into. From convict times, about a quarter of the white population were Catholic Irish, at least nominally, and they were among the poorer classes of society by and large, with a few exceptions like Mr. Plunkett here. Well, the Catholic Church encouraged a partly separate culture by means like church going, the Catholic school system, organisations like guilds, and sermons against mixed marriages. There was a lot of low-level sectarianism on both sides, such as job discrimination. It was endemic, but very, very rarely violent. A few instances, but it's rare. And then the distinctiveness of the Irish Catholic community dissipated from about the 1950s. All right, well, first story is Father Dixon. Let's start near the beginning. Next slide, please. Yeah, that shows up quite well. This is a contemporary picture, the only one, of the 1804 Castle Hill Rebellion of Irish convicts. It's regarded as the most serious rebellion in Australian history, even though, strangely, the number of persons known to have been killed or injured by the rebels is thought to be zero. It's true that 30 rebels or so were executed later. The picture shows the confrontation between the rebels on the right and the New South Wales Corps lined up neatly on the left. In the middle, you can see a small figure in black under the little caption, that kind of thought bubble, the cartoon bubble, which is Father James Dixon. Next slide, please. This is a blow-up of that bit of the picture. And there he is in the kind of clerical black dress, addressing the people with their pitchforks. And he's saying to the rebels, "Lay down your arms, my deluded countrymen." Here's the background to that remarkable event. Father Dixon was born in 1758 in Castle Ridge, County Wexford, and educated for the priesthood at Salamanca and Louvain. There were no seminaries in Ireland at that time. During the rebellion of 1798, he was convicted of aiding the rebels, almost certainly wrongly, and transported with two other priests to Botany Bay. In Sydney, Governor King feared the large number of Irish rebels being transported. What if the French sailed up the Hawkesbury and joined them? All he had to defend himself from being killed in his bed was the New South Wales Corps, who, as it turned out in the Rum Rebellion a few years later, were a danger to public order worse than the French and the Irish combined. The question for King was whether a mild-mannered and cooperative Catholic priest, such as Father Dixon, was a net positive or negative for managing the Irish convicts. He was inclined to think it was negative and all priests were seditious, but he received instructions to the contrary from his boss, Lord Hobart, the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. Hobart knew this issue well, as 10 years before he had been in Dublin in charge of negotiations with the Archbishop on what to do about the southern threat that had just blown up to both of them, the French Revolution. They decided on cooperation, and there was passed a Lord Hobart's Relief Act, which made things much easier for Catholics, and that cooperation between the government and church, British government, until Irish government, is by and large held from that day to this. Back in Sydney, King announced in 1803 that Catholic masses said by Father Dixon were to be tolerated, and Dixon was to be paid a government salary. It seemed to work well. On the 1st of March 1804, King wrote back to Hobart like this: "The indulgence proposed by your lordship respecting the Reverend Mr. Dixon performing the functions of the clerical office of a Roman Catholic has had the most salutary effects on the number of Irish Catholics we have, and since its toleration there has been not the most distant cause for complaint among the description who regularly attend church service." But he spoke too soon. 3 days later, the Castle Hill Rebellion broke out. Major Johnson took a detachment of troops on a forced march to Castle Hill to confront the rebels. He took Father Dixon with him. Dixon tricked the rebel leaders into being captured, and it was all over quickly. King removed Father Dixon's right to minister, even though when it came to the point, he'd risked his life for the sake of peace. Meanwhile, the church authorities in Rome had received a letter about Father Dixon. When they worked out where it was from, which must have taken a while, they were quite excited. They sent him a document excusing him from any defects in proper canonical forms that may have been necessary in these difficult circumstances, giving him the impressive title Prefect Apostolic of New Holland, and urging him to get out and convert the Pacific Islands. Father Dixon soon went home to Ireland, and there were no more Catholic priests allowed until 1820. Nevertheless, his pioneering work had set a pattern that continued for a century or more. The Catholic population were convicts and later lower class immigrants and their children. The Catholic clergy were cooperative with government and sometimes subsidised by them, and they kept to spiritual rather than political concerns. Next topic is Cardinal Moran and the Irish ecclesiastical empire. Let's move forward to the late 19th century. By then, the British Empire was the world's leading power, and the Australian colonies were a significant and wealthy part of it. From the point of view of the Catholic Church leaders in Rome, it was, of course, unfortunate that so much of the world was dominated by a heretic queen and operating in a language they couldn't understand and under political forms that appeared to incorporate Masonic liberal ideas of democracy. But it was also an opportunity. The empire was full of Irish, mostly English-speaking Irish, and if they could just be supplied with ministers before they lost their faith in strange churchless lands, the Irish ecclesiastical empire might spread in the lands occupied politically by the British one. The man in charge of the plan was Cardinal Cullen, rector of the Irish College in Rome from 1831 and later Archbishop of Dublin. Here's the book about it. Next slide, please. Just a few years old, Ireland's Empire by Colin Barr. Notice the cover picture. The cover image is a stained glass window which says St. Patrick pray for us, but it is St. Patrick picture. It's a picture of Daniel O'Connell, and the legend says, erected by the Burrowa O'Connell Centenary Committee, August 1975. Burrowa is Burrowa in central western New South Wales, a rural area with the state's highest concentration of Catholic Irish. And actually an image of a political figure like that is very rare. Nearly all stained glass window subjects are strictly spiritual. But it does show that the spread of the ecclesiastical empire was going very well. Well, following the death of the second of two English archbishops of Sydney in 1883, Cullen had his choice of successor. He chose his nephew and ward, Patrick Francis Moran. And Cardinal Moran, as he soon was, dominated the Australian Church until his death in 1911. We'll take one example of his achievements, chosen partly because the visuals are good, which is his ecclesiastical architecture, certainly in the grand style. His idea was that you took a hill dominating some part of Sydney and put an enormous Gothic pile on it with some visible statuary. His architecture's choice was the firm of Sheeran and Hennessy. And here are 3 examples of their work. St Patrick's Seminary, Manly, which was the main seminary for a large part of the Australian Catholic Church from 1889 to 1995. It's also enshrined in Australian myth as the setting for the first novels of former seminarian Thomas Keneally and for the complaints on leaving of another seminarian, Tony Abbott. Next picture. You can see the similarity in style, I think. This is the Sacred Heart Monastery, Kensington, built in 1897, the centre of the missionary of the Sacred Heart's vast missionary empire in the Pacific and remote Australia. The MSCs are actually a French order, but like other French orders here, they soon attracted many Irish Australian recruits. And thirdly, St Joseph's College, Hunters Hill, built 1884 to 1994. So how many Joey's boys are there here other than myself? 2. Thank you. Yeah. Those 3 were very enclosed communities, 2 being seminaries and 1 an all boarding school. Buildings, of course, are outward signs of what's going on. The real empire, of course, was internal to minds. People prayed, repented of their sins and tried to do better, were inspired to work for charity and found hope on their deathbeds. That was not happening just in Sydney. Around 1900, almost all Australian Catholic bishops were Irish. The first Australian-born bishop was appointed in 1897. His name was Patrick Vincent Dwyer. There was a massive influx of Irish nuns, priests and religious brothers as well, whereas by that time, general immigration from Ireland had tailed off. Next story is about Eileen O'Connor and Our Lady's Nurses for the Poor. Eileen is expected to be Australia's 2nd Catholic saint and the first one who's really a Sydney person. I hope you're all barracking for her. Well, these things take time, but some public support always helps. The story gives an insight into the lives of the very poor Irish Catholic communities of the inner cities. She was born in inner Melbourne in 1892 to Irish immigrant parents. At the age of 3, she was dropped out of a pram and suffered a severe spinal injury, which gave her extreme pain for the rest of her life and meant she never reached 4 feet tall. She died aged 28 in Coogee in 1921. Despite those extremely limiting circumstances, with the help of an Irish-Australian MSc priest from Kensington, Father McGrath, she founded in Coogee a group of women dedicated to looking after the poor in their own homes. This is the original group of nurses. That's the picture. You can see from the surnames. This is Eileen O'Connor herself. The next picture is the original group of nurses. Yeah, you can see from the surnames where this is coming from ethnically, and the order still exists in Coogee. The nature of the community that the nurses served can be seen through a few extracts from the records of their work, and I'll read a couple of paragraphs of their records from the 1920s from Boland's book about Eileen. Mrs. B of Surrey Hills was senile. She'd been blind for 60 years. She lived with an elderly son and daughter, but they were all undernourished. The nurses took them food every couple of days. Generally, they needed no special medical care, but food and domestic help. Master M of Waterloo had spent several months in Waterloo Tuberculosis Hospital. On the night of August 1927, he was sent home with 15 large bed sores. He was paralysed in the lower part of his body. He was 16 and an orphan, his home being with his grandmother and an uncle. The nurses were present when he arrived in an ambulance. They bathed him, treated his bed sores and tidied up. Thus began a series of daily calls that were still going on when records ceased in 1929, etc. I'm on the Historical Commission looking into the records of Eileen's life for the historical process. The president of that commission, I'm glad to say, is Jocelyn, who is present. I can't tell you any details about how it's going, except that we promise we'll finish sometime soon or soonish. Rural, as our next topic, rural Catholic life and around the Boree log. Next, please. This is the picture we use as the theme for the Australian Catholic Historical Society's website. It's St Carthage's Silverton, which is out past Broken Hill. That's getting very remote. St Carthage is an old Irish saint, a semi-mythical. Just as a reminder, that's just as a reminder of how remote it could get. So if you're talking an ecclesiastical empire, you've got to be building out in very, very remote countries. It was hard to project the church out there, as celebrated in the poem of Bush Christening by Banjo Patterson. Banjo Patterson is not Catholic, so we're looking here at a perception of the Irish Catholic community from outsiders. And here is the first stanza. So the story is about McGee's son, who has to be christened age 10, because there hasn't been a chance for the priest to get out there before that. He overhears the plans and thinks christening must be something like branding cattle, so he's hard to catch, etc. So men of religion were certainly scanty out there, and women too, although the nuns often did get further out there than priests. So there's stories about families having their children brought from the bush to be christened, half a dozen at a time, since it's been that long since the priest had visited. But the communities portrayed in the verse of John O'Brien are somewhat more settled than that. Real name of his was Patrick Hartigan. He was parish priest of Narandra for many years in the early 20th century. Next. This is the cover image of his later edition of his book, Around the Bory Log. Celebrates the religious life, especially of the Catholic community out there. Here they are, all arriving for Sunday Mass in times before there are cars. It's popular poetry, what some city intellectuals would call popular and sentimental, but let's take a verse of his poem to remind you that it's quite powerful all the same. This is a verse from the Little Irish Mother, so you can see what it's like. I'll leave you a moment to read that. The theme that you see in the third line and the second last line about the, so to speak, transfer of Irishness into Australian nationalism is something of a theme of, among other people, Archbishop Mannix. You can also see it on video. There's a 1929 silent movie around the Bory Log made with local actors and uses local accounts around the Goulburn area, memories of decades earlier, and you can see some of it, if you like, on the Australian Catholic Historical Society website. Very atmospheric. This is next picture is a still from it. So a number of the poems are about the local priest himself. And they're rather something of an insight into the clerical perspective on operating in a community like that. I have a remote connection to that sort of thing, as my mother, Carmel Kennedy, was born in a community similar to that near Mudgee in 1917. And actually, I think the best portrayal of that sort of poor Irish rural Catholic life is Bernard O'Reilly's Cullen Benbog, which is set in the Megalong Valley in the Blue Mountains, but we don't have quite time to go into that at more length. Now, obviously, we can't do the story of Irish Catholic Australia without mentioning its best known member, Daniel Mannix, Archbishop of Melbourne from 1917 to 1963. Next picture. Here's my book trying to get to the truth about him. He was, though, very much a one-off in such respects as Irish nationalism and his contempt almost for Vatican orders. So those themes are specific to himself and were not really shared by the Australian Catholic community. The Australian Catholic community tended to emphasise being Catholic, but not being Irish. They were almost, to a man and woman, were not interested in Irish nationalism. And many of them simply forgot all about their Irish ancestors, except that they'd had grandparents there. And even the ones born in Ireland were not it seemed to me very keen to talk about it back there. Of course, that was in some cases not surprising given what they'd left. But yeah, just tonight we're going to pass over Mannix without giving the attention that he was confident he deserved. Just here, I'll keep to New South Wales stories. Now, those are some of the stories, and as you can see, many of them are about Catholics doing things with one another, disconnected from the wider Australian society. We need to make a few remarks about the theme of separateness versus assimilation. The first thing is that the new country provided better opportunities for Irish Catholics, by and large, to get ahead than Ireland or England did. As Patrick Morgan points out, while in Ireland the Irish hadn't made much political progress in 8 centuries, in Victoria there was an Irish premier 20 years after Melbourne was founded. Some people, it's true, were outraged at the inversion of the natural order, but it's Australia, what do you expect? Man was laying eggs for summer and the winter, Irish in charge. Well, that's how the kind of thing that happens. Australia had an Irish Catholic Prime Minister in 1929, well before it would have been possible in comparable countries. Australia had the ethnic religious composition of Ulster, but avoided the troubles of that location. Royal Orange Lodges were never big in Australia, in existence, but never popular. And that was due to a general attitude of restraint on both sides. You might say easygoingness. Many immigrants were happy to forget about some of the old hatreds on the voyage out. Few Irish Catholics were interested in Irish nationalism, except for Mannix, of course. However, mixing into one big family, what we now call the Anglo-Celtic people, didn't proceed smoothly or simply or quickly. For one thing, there was a strong undercurrent of sectarianism on both sides. Catholics had distinctive surnames and practices, though after a while they didn't have distinctive accents. Discrimination against them in jobs was real, though patchy, and it was a serious issue, especially in economic hard times where everyone was looking after their own little mates. The other issue was that for Australian Catholic Church leaders, separation was a feature, not a bug. They believed that the more separately the Irish Catholics lived, the better they would retain their faith. No doubt they were right about that. So they worked hard to maintain an enclosed culture. The main event in doing that was the withdrawal of state aid for church schools for the 90 years from the 1870s to the 1960s. The church therefore set up its own system of schools, paid for by themselves and staffed by religious who were paid nothing but keep. Naturally, Catholics resented that they, the poorest section of the community, had to pay taxes for public schools which they didn't use, and then pay again for church schools. The schools were certainly what we would now call under-resourced. Next picture. This is a picture of a Catholic infant school in Sydney, which looks superficially, I think, like something decrepit from the 20s and 30s. And actually, it's a picture of my first Holy Communion in 1960. I'm not sure which one is me. I think it's in the first, maybe the second row. The Catholic school system, though, was not the only device for keeping the Catholic community separate. Sermons inveighed against mixed marriages, and canon law made them as difficult as possible. Ben Chifley, for example, was automatically excommunicated for marrying in a Presbyterian church in 1914. No joining Masonic lodges. Various penalties in the afterlife were provided for attending a Protestant church service, including weddings. They didn't like boys joining the Boy Scouts, or by some Masons in shorts. So there was a separate Catholic Scout movement. It was affiliated with the Scouting movement, but separate. Eileen O'Connor's brother was a scoutmaster of the Coogee Troop, and so on. We'll look at a few more of the tribal organisations in a moment. The policy was quite successful in maintaining a tribal faith, followed enthusiastically for the most part. It does raise the difficult question of to what extent it was actually a faith. That is, people believed it literally. It's not easy to say that because if people are pretending to believe, then they won't tell you ex hypothesi. It's also complicated by the fact that you can half believe it or believe half of it. My impression is that nearly all clergy did believe nearly all of it, though I have doubts about just a few. I doubt if the pedophile priest Gerald Ridsdale did, judging by what he said at the Royal Commission. He does not give the impression of being a man of faith or having been a man of faith. The laity, it's just hard to tell what percentage really believed. A large number did. Others might have been just sticking with the practices of their family or tribe, or doing what they thought was good for the kids' education. If anybody in the question time can have evidence casting light on that, I'm certainly keen to hear it. And in case you're wondering, I do believe it, give or take maybe in some of the fine detail handed down by the Vatican from time to time. Let's look at some tribal organisations, and we're moving forward to the period of between the wars, which was the high point of organisational marching up and down generally. It wasn't just the Hitler Youth and Surf Lifesavers who were dressing up in uniforms and marching. There was a huge growth of special purpose Catholic organisations. One less successful one was the political party of around 1920, the Catholic Federation, whose story has been well written by Jeff Kildare. Many others were lower key but long-lived. One that's still not too well understood was the Knights of the Southern Cross, a kind of Catholic version of the Freemasons, which combated job discrimination and did any other jobs the Archbishop wanted. There is a book about it, but it's extremely scrappy. Many occupational guilds were set up to gather Catholics in particular industries for both spiritual and organisational purposes. So the church thought that, well, in that people after school are mixing, of course, in the workplace with non-Catholics, but it'd be good to have an organisation where they could get together and help each other and have an annual communion breakfast, that kind of thing. For example, there was quite a large one in the transport industries. There was a medical one, a legal one, the St Thomas Law Society, the Dentists' Guild of St Apollonia, called after an ancient martyr whose tortures included having her teeth pulled out, and the Police Guild of St Christopher. Let's just have a few pictures of one of the best known of those and best supported of those tribal organisations, the Joey's First 15. Their coach, Brother Henry, real name Francis Xavier Gaffney, is one of the few sports coaches to have an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and very deservedly. Here's a posed shot from later life. He lived into his 90s. I met him just once on the first day I was at Joey's. His first 15 won most of the GPS rugby premierships from 1923 to 1953. Next, here's a picture of the tribe actually gathered. A figure of 20,000 is the Joey's game against Kings in 1956. That figure is not a wild guess. It's said to be based on ticket sales. In preparation for this talk, I asked the historian of Joey's rugby, Jimmy Gray, what he had to tell me, and he sent me this nice piece of purple prose from his book on what it was all about. Next. 3. If you weren't sure that the stuff in church was literally true, well, there was something else for you. I suppose if I speak about only Joey's, the Riverview boys will complain. So let me just tell you a story that Gerard Windsor, a historian of Riverview College, told when he gave a talk to the Australian Catholic Historical Society a week or two ago. He said that after leaving Riverview, he went for a few years to a Jesuit novitiate and came out of that in his mid-20s. At that time, he'd hardly met anyone who wasn't a Catholic. So there was some success in creating a semi-enclosed community. All right, last topic, the Carl government and the Vice Squad. Undoubtedly, the most powerful organisation of the tribe was the Labor Right, especially in New South Wales. Its golden age was during Joe Carl's government in the 1950s. Next slide. Book about him. Carl himself was an immensely successful politician coming from Marrickville, which was core Catholic territory. I don't guarantee this story is true, but it's very old and indicates the perceptions anyway. A woman member of the Marrickville branch of the Labor Party came into a meeting late and a little flustered. She accidentally genuflected, and when everyone laughed, she said, "Well, it's all the same faces." As Attorney General, Carl in the 50s had Bill Sheehan and then Reg Downing, who were cousins and fellow ex-students of St Patrick's School, Goulburn. Also useful to the government was the support of five fellow tribal members, Cardinal Gilroy and his auxiliary, Bishop James Carroll. Particularly useful, as it turned out, when the Labor split of 1925 destroyed Labor in Victoria and Queensland, and loyalty to the Cardinal was called in to prevent a split in New South Wales and keep the Carl government in office. Well, yeah, depending on when you call it. When I say Labor split of 1955, I mean that was the kind of nadir when everything was completely falling apart. And people were out of office in Victoria, and federally Labor lost another election as a result of the split. But the state opposition was weak, and the Carl government had free rein to do pretty much what it liked. Well, except for one thing. It couldn't grant state aid to church schools, which was prevented by the Labor federal executive. But one thing they did was abolish capital punishment. Then Carl was convinced that the public needed an opera house on Bennelong Point, and with some difficulty, he persuaded the Labor conference to back it. And they took action in another field that might or might not be considered especially Catholic interest, vice. Here they were assisted by a useful development in the police force. The Police Guild of St Christopher had an annual communion breakfast since, I think, 1939. And for the 1952 breakfast, they had something big to celebrate. The group of the Freemasons had finally been loosened, and New South Wales had its first Catholic police commissioner, Colin Delaney. Here he is pictured with Albert Namatjira. There was also a Catholic, Ron Walden, a former Wallabies captain, as head of the Vice Squad. The most famous figure in the Vice Squad, though, wasn't the head. It was an ex-footballer, rugby league, Bumper Farrell, head of the Vice Squad in Darlinghurst in the 50s and 60s. Next. Pictured here. There's a book-length biography of him, and this story from Bumper's childhood in Marrickville is about the Catholic tribe taking direct action. The date of this would be about 1927. Somebody recalls, Bumper and I and some other kids were playing cricket in the street. We saw some well-dressed men and women open the gate, march up the path, climb the steps and knock on Bumper's door. They were carrying a gramophone, one of those you crank up with a lever and the music comes out of a horn, and a stand. Meg Farrell, that's Bumper's mum, answered their knock, her face thunderous. The kids crowded close, sensing that something exciting was about to happen. One suited man told Mrs. Farrell that surely this was her lucky day because he intended to play her a record. Bumper's mother's eyes narrowed further, but she motioned for him to proceed. He ceremoniously placed the gramophone on the stand and turned the handle, which caused a voice to blare out of the gramophone, declaring that Seventh-day Adventism was the one true religion and Catholicism was the disgrace born of Satan that was leading the world to ruin. The speaker didn't get to finish his spiel. Meg picked up the gramophone and pitched it as hard and as high as she could over the picket fence and out onto the yard, out onto the road where it smashed into pieces. The stand followed the gramophone. She then chased the Seventh-day Adventist, cursing at the top of her voice and throwing haymakers off the property. Farrell himself was famous for often giving delinquent youth a kick up the backside and sending them home. The Vice Squad saw itself as having a pastoral as well as a strictly policing role. It conducted dawn patrols to warn and sometimes rescue women in near prostitution situations. Normally accompanied, they took a policewoman with them. In 1947, they took two women from a cafe in Pitt Street at 8 a.m, questioned them beside a police car and demanded to look in their purses. The women were in fact GPO telephonists who had just come from attending early mass for Ascension Thursday, and they didn't appreciate being treated as prostitutes. The Catholic Weekly made a scene on their behalf. Now here the story takes a strange turn. So when Colin Delaney became Police Commissioner, he was in a position to advise the government on what issues to prioritise. Can you guess what he took to be the greatest menace facing Australia? I want to have takers. Next slide. It was homosexuals. The issue seems to have been a personal crusade of his. You have to wonder why, but his advice was taken. The laws against homosexuality were tightened and police resources were devoted to entrapping men in public toilets. The leaders of government, Carl, Sheehan and Downing, being enlightened men of the 1950s, addressed the problem also with modern science, that is psychiatry. They converted the old Coombe jail into what they were proud to say was the world's only jail reserved exclusively for homosexual offenders, with accommodation for 128 offenders. Single-celled accommodation, needless to say. There, the inmates were studied by psychiatrists with a view to finding causes and cures of what they had said to have wrong with them. The government then set up a committee of inquiry to report on the problem in 1958, chaired by the Professor of Psychiatry at Sydney University. 5 years later, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that the committee was about to issue its report. That's the last heard of it, and no copies of the report are known to exist. If you find one, the historians of Gay Sydney will give you a medal. Time doesn't permit me to recount the amazing story of the Vice Squad's biggest scalp, Sir Eugene Goosens. You can come to my ACHS talk next year to hear about that. Meanwhile, for more, please consult the Australian Historical Society's website for its page on Irish Catholic Australians. And finally, since we haven't had enough pictures of nuns, to finish, here's a great one I used as the cover image of an earlier book. Thank you. That's all.